Wyoming, October 1887, a wedding night no one in Red Hollow would ever forget. "It hurts. Let's try again," she whispered, eyes glistening, voice barely holding. Caleb went completely still, watching her with an expression nobody in that room could read then. Slowly, he reached out his hand. "Whatever you think happened on their wedding night, you're wrong. And the truth is far more shocking than anything your imagination is offering you right now. If you want to know what really happened between them in that room, don't go anywhere." Stagecoach arrived after dark, listing to one side like something broken that refused to quit moving. Evelyn Shaw stepped down before the driver finished stopping. She landed hard on the frozen ground and kept walking. Her right hand was pressed against her chest, wrapped tight in linen, gone dark at the center. Her green traveling dress was gray with road dust. Her coat had a torn pocket. She carried nothing except a small leather satchel, and the weight of knowing something most people would rather she forgot. Red Hollow was quiet at this hour. A few lamps burned in windows. Wood smoke drifted low against the cold. Behind her, two riders appeared at the far end of the road, slowing when they spotted the town. She did not look back. The church was easy to find. Small towns always put it where everyone could see it. She pushed the door open without knocking. 6 people turned to look at her. The minister stood at the front, papers in hand, expression balanced somewhere between irritation and alarm. An older woman sat in the first pew. A younger man Evelyn did not recognize stood near the side wall. And there, beside the altar, was Caleb Mercer. She had imagined him from his letters. She had been wrong in almost every detail. He was taller than she expected, lean rather than broad, wearing a brown wool coat that had seen serious weather, black hair with gray starting at the temples, a thin scar below his jaw. He stood the way men stand when they're accustomed to watching, without being watched. He looked at her hand first, then her face. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Miss Shaw." He came toward her slowly, not rushing, and stopped at a respectful distance. His voice was lower than she'd pictured. "You're hurt. I'm aware." She kept her tone even. "Are you still willing to proceed?" He didn't answer immediately. She respected that. A man who answered too fast was usually answering himself. Not the question. Do you need a doctor before anything else? After. She looked at the minister. "Please." The ceremony was short. Evelyn stood straight through all of it. The older woman, who introduced herself as Dr. Miriam Vale, stood as witness and watched Evelyn's face with the careful attention of someone building a medical opinion in real time. When it was done, Caleb put the ring on her finger gently, leaving enough room that it didn't press against her knuckles. A small thing. She noticed it anyway. Outside, the 2 riders had stopped at the end of the road. They didn't come closer. They didn't leave either. Miriam examined her hand by lamplight in the church's back room. She unwound the linen without comment, which Evelyn appreciated. When the bandage came free, the doctor studied what was beneath it the same way. Evelyn studied a telegraph machine, searching for what was broken, estimating what could be repaired. 2 fingers, Miriam said, the middle and the ring. They've been badly compressed. There's bruising through the tissue all the way to here. She indicated the base of Evelyn's palm. "How long ago?" 6 days. Miriam was quiet for a moment. "Have you been using them?" Evelyn said nothing. "I'll take that as a yes." The doctor began rebandaging with clean linen, moving efficiently. "Depending on how much more strain these take, you could lose full movement permanently. I want you to understand that clearly." "I understand." "All right." Miriam tied off the bandage. "Then I've done my part." Caleb was waiting near the door when they came out. He'd spoken to the riders while Evelyn was being examined. She could tell from the way they were gone now. She didn't ask what he'd said. He held the door of his wagon open and waited for her to climb up herself before stepping around to the driver's side. Another small thing, another thing she noticed. The ranch was several miles out of town, set back from the road behind a split-rail fence that needed one section repaired. The house was larger than she'd expected and less decorated. Practical, a working place. Inside, Caleb lit 2 lamps and showed her the rooms without ceremony or explanation. Kitchen, sitting room, his study toward the back. A bedroom at the end of the hall, separate from his own. Keys, he said, and placed a full ring on the table. Every room, including mine if you ever need it for any reason. She picked them up. Thank you. We'll figure out arrangements as we go. He kept his hands in his coat pockets. But I want to say this once, clearly. Marriage doesn't give me authority over you. It doesn't give me an opinion about your choices unless you ask for one. You're a free person. That's not going to change because of what we did tonight. Evelyn looked at him. She'd heard promises before. She'd learned to measure them by what came after. All right, she said. She meant I'm listening, not I believe you yet. He seemed to understand the difference. She found the telegraph machine an hour later. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd gone to the study for paper, to make notes on what she needed to do by morning, and there it sat on the back shelf, an old military sounder. Brass fittings, the kind used by Army scouts in the field. Dusty, not used in years. But intact. Her heart moved in a way she'd been carefully preventing all day. She set her satchel on the desk and examined the machine without touching it, traced the wire with her eyes to where it ran up through the wall. Military lines sometimes crossed with railroad lines in this part of Wyoming. Sometimes they didn't, but sometimes was enough. She sat down. She used her left hand to check the connection points. Tightened one fitting, checked the battery contact. The needle twitched. The line was live. She pressed the key with her left hand and sent a test signal. 3 short taps. Nothing came back. She adjusted the receiver coil. Tried again with her right hand, and the pain came sharp and immediate, climbing from her fingers straight to her shoulder. She stopped, breathed, tried again. She was on the 3rd attempt when the study door opened. Caleb stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, holding a lamp. He looked at the telegraph machine. He looked at her hand, at the fresh red seeping through the center of the bandage. "Stop," he said, and he crossed the room. "Don't." She pulled her hand back before he could reach the key. He stopped. He didn't argue. He just stood there and waited. She had not expected that, either. "There are 12 men," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Railroad workers. They didn't do what Blackwood is saying they did. They're scheduled to hang at sunrise." She met his eyes. "I have to get a warning to the next station before that happens." He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of warning?" "A specific coded message, sent in a specific sequence. If the right person on the other end receives it, they'll know what it means." She looked at the machine. "The line is live. I just can't." She stopped. Caleb looked at the key, then at her. "Tell me how." She blinked. "Tell me what to press," he said. "I'll press it." She studied him for a long moment. A man she'd known for 4 hours. A man she'd been corresponding with for 6 months and thought she understood and was still in the process of deciding. She needed help. She had always needed help from the moment Blackwood's men had crushed her hand against the desk and told her this was what silence felt like. She hadn't asked for it. Not once. Not from anyone. "Sit here," she said. He sat. She guided his hand to the key and began reading the code aloud. Dot dash dot dot. Pause. He followed without hesitating, without asking her to slow down, without taking over. They were 4 lines into the message when the pain in her hand surged through everything else, and she stopped mid-transmission. Caleb lifted his hand from the key immediately. Evelyn pressed her lips together, breathed through her nose. The room was very quiet except for the wind outside and the small electrical sound of the open line. "We can wait," he said. "No." She steadied herself. Looked at the key. "It hurts." A breath. "Let's try again." He put his hand back on the key and waited for her to begin. They finished the transmission together. Evelyn's voice. Caleb's hand. When it was done, she sat back and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then the sounder came alive. Tap. Tap dash. Tap tap. She translated it before the last signal finished. Execution moved. 12 men hang tomorrow at noon. Shaw code compromised. She read it twice. The words stayed the same. Then she read the signature at the end. The call sign, the one she would have recognized anywhere in the world, in any sequence, in any rhythm. Her foster father had been dead for 3 weeks. His name was at the bottom of the message. Caleb was gone before first light. Evelyn heard the door, then hoofbeats moving away from the house at a steady trot. She still for a moment, listening to the silence he left behind, then got up and went to the study. The message was still there on the paper she'd copied it onto with her left hand. Execution moved. 12 men hang tomorrow at noon. Shaw Code compromised. And beneath it, Amos's call sign, his exact rhythm, the particular weight on the dash that she'd watched him develop over 30 years of sending. Almost. She sat down at the machine and played the transmission back in her memory the way she'd been trained to do. Amos had taught her that every operator left fingerprints in their rhythm, the speed of the dots, the breath between words, the way a person hesitated before a number versus a letter. You couldn't fake it perfectly, not unless you'd sat beside someone for years and learned them the way you learned a language. Whoever sent this message had studied Amos, studied him carefully. But there was one pause between the 6th and 7th signal of the call sign that ran about a half-second too long. Amos never paused there. His rhythm on his own name was automatic. The same every time, the way a person signs their own signature without thinking. This operator had thought about it. She was still sitting with that information when Caleb came back. He'd ridden the perimeter of the property and part of the eastern pasture. He came in through the back, hung his coat, and set a coffee pot on the stove without being asked. He moved around the kitchen like a man who'd been alone long enough that he'd stopped noticing it. "I found the wire," he said. Evelyn came to the kitchen doorway. Someone ran a line from Blackwood's company cable across the north corner of my pasture. He poured 2 cups and set one near her without pressing her to take it. Recent work. The ground still disturbed where they buried it. They connected it to my telegraph line through the exterior junction box. Which means any message I send from your machine goes across my line, and there's both. He sat down. They've been able to read everything since before you arrived. Evelyn thought about that. Then the reply we received this night either came from an ally inside Blackwood's network, or someone wanted you to think it did. She picked up the cup. The coffee was strong, and she drank it without comment. "I'm going to disconnect the splice this morning," Caleb said. "But if I do, they'll know we found it." "Leave it," she said immediately. He looked at her. "A line they think we don't know about is more useful to us than no line at all." She set the cup down. "We can choose what we send across it." Caleb was quiet a moment. Then he nodded once, the way a person nods when they've just revised an opinion. Miriam came by mid-morning with fresh linen and a jar of something that smelled like pine and alcohol. She changed Evelyn's bandage at the kitchen table, while Caleb repaired the telegraph sounder in the study, his movements careful and precise through the open door. "Move your middle finger," Miriam said. Evelyn moved it, not far. The pain came in a straight line from the tip to the wrist, and the ring finger less movement there. Maybe half as much as the middle. Miriam made a small sound and began rapping. "You sent another transmission last night." "It wasn't a question." "A partial one," Evelyn said. "Evelyn." Miriam tied off the bandage with efficient hands. "I'm not going to tell you what to do. That's not my role, and it wouldn't be appropriate. But I am going to keep telling you what's true about this hand. And what's true is that every time you strain these 2 fingers, the window for full recovery gets smaller." She sat back. "That's the information. You decide what to do with it." Evelyn looked at her wrapped hand. "Amos taught me to send at 40 words per minute by the time I was 16. He used to say the key was an extension of thought, not of the hand." She paused. "I'm learning to believe him from a different direction." Miriam said nothing, but she didn't look dismissive either. "Through the doorway," Caleb said. "Sounder's working." After Miriam left, Evelyn sat across from Caleb at the study desk and taught him railroad emergency abbreviations. He was a faster learner than she expected. He already knew standard military Morse, which covered more ground than she'd assumed, and he had the patience to repeat a sequence without frustration when he got it wrong. Most people tapped too hard when they were concentrating. Caleb's pressure was even from the start. Railroad operators use shortened codes under time pressure, she explained. XR means crossing, DP means departure, EMER means emergency stop requested, not ordered. The distinction matters because one triggers automatic response and one requires confirmation. Who decides which to use, the operator on site, based on what they can observe and what they can verify? She watched him practice the EMER sequence. It requires judgment. He tapped it through once more. Clean. You've used a telegraph key before, she said, not just in training. He kept his eyes on the machine. Some. She let it sit. She was getting better at knowing which silences were locked doors and which were just closed ones. By mid-afternoon, she had him recognizing the difference between a transmission sent under pressure and one sent deliberately. Speed wasn't the only indicator. Pressure pattern changed. Error frequency changed. The rhythm of a frightened operator was different from a confident one, in ways that were almost musical once you knew what you were hearing. Every operator has a signature, she said. Rhythm, weight, timing. I can identify people I've never met in person just from reading their transmissions. It's like a voice. Caleb looked at her. Could you identify the person who sent that message last night? I already have. She reached for her notes. I just don't know who they are yet. Only what they sound like. Sarah Whitcomb arrived at the ranch just before 4 o'clock, driving a small mail wagon with the deliberate speed of someone who had a reason to look ordinary. She was 54, broad-shouldered, with gray hair pinned under a practical hat, and eyes that took in a room the way Evelyn's took in a telegraph transmission quickly, completely, not missing anything at the edges. Post office business, she announced at the door, handing Caleb a mailbag with nothing meaningful in it. Then she came inside and sat down and told them what she actually knew. They moved the prisoners last night, sometime between 9 and midnight. She accepted a cup of coffee from Caleb and held it without drinking. The jail's empty. No announcement. No transfer papers filed at the station. They're just gone. Evelyn felt the weight of it settle into her thinking. There's more, Sarah said. She reached into her coat and produced a folded paper. Blackwood put this out this morning, distributed to every business on the main street. Caleb took it and read it. Then he handed it to Evelyn without a word. It was a printed notice. Her name was at the top. Below it, an accusation of theft from Blackwood Continental Railroad falsified records, diverted funds, company property removed without authorization. At the bottom, a line about her involvement in the death of senior telegraph engineer Amos Shaw. Evelyn read it twice. Her expression didn't change, which required more effort than it used to. He's efficient, she said. I'll give him that. There's a warrant coming, Sarah said. My guess is end of the week. If Blackwood can get his man in front of the circuit judge fast enough. She looked at Caleb. It'll name you too. Accessory. Caleb took that information and set it somewhere practical. How much time does that give us? 3 days. Maybe 4. Evelyn folded the notice and placed it on the desk. Then we used the time. After Sarah left, the ranch was quiet for a while. Outside, the wind had picked up. The temperature was dropping again, the cold that settled into everything before a proper freeze. Evelyn went to the window and watched the last of the afternoon light disappear from the pasture. There was a windmill at the far end of the north field. Old, looked like it hadn't turned in years. She watched it for a moment. Then she watched the shadow at its base, which was shaped wrong for the time of day. Caleb, she said quietly. He came to stand beside her. The windmill, she said. He looked, said nothing. But she saw his hand move slightly toward his coat. Not yet, she said. He didn't reach for anything. He just looked the same as her. Someone's been standing there long enough that the ground around their feet is disturbed, she said. See the shadow? Facing us. I see it. She turned away from the window. We keep moving normally. Make it clear we're staying the night, not running. She went back to the desk. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to send a message across that compromised line. Caleb turned from the window. To the person using Amos's call sign? Yes. She picked up her pen, but I'm going to use a code only Amos's closest students would recognize. If whoever is on the other end knows it, they learned it directly from him. She looked at Caleb. That tells us something important about who we're dealing with. Caleb sat down across from her. Outside, the wind moved across the pasture, and the windmill stayed still. An hour later, the telegraph sounder came to life. Evelyn leaned forward. The message came through in Amos's borrowed rhythm, with that same half-second pause in the call sign. She transcribed it. The 12 are not in Red Hollow. Find freight car 702 before midnight. She read it once. Then the sounder cracked a sharp, irregular sound and went silent. She turned to look at the machine. The brass casing had a new hole through the side, small and precise. Glass from the window behind the desk was on the floor. The cold came through immediately. Caleb was already moving. He pulled her away from the desk and down, one hand on her shoulder, no force in it, just direction. The sounder was destroyed. The study window was shattered. The line was cut somewhere outside. In the silence that followed, Evelyn realized she was still holding her transcription paper. Find freight car 702 before midnight. She looked at the clock on the study wall. They had 5 hours. The departure schedule was in the railroad booklet. Sarah had quietly slipped into the mailbag, along with nothing else worth reading. Evelyn found freight car 702 listed on the 3rd page. Coal train. Departure from Red Hollow, switching yard at 3 in the morning, heading north. It was officially flagged as a standard freight transfer. Coal trains don't run that route at night in October, Caleb said. He was reading over her shoulder, which she allowed because he'd earned the right to look at what she was looking at. The northern cut ices over. It's been Blackwood policy for 2 years. No freight runs that canyon after dark between October and March. So either the policy changed tonight specifically, or the freight isn't coal. Evelyn closed the booklet. We need to go now. There won't be another window. Caleb looked at her hand, then back at her face. You could tell me where the car is and I could go. She understood why he said it. She also understood it was the wrong answer. You don't know what you're looking for inside that car, she said. You don't know how to operate the relay equipment, if there is any. And if someone needs to send a signal from that yard in the next 3 hours, you can't do it without me. She picked up her coat. I'll manage the riding. He didn't argue further. That was becoming something she counted on. They went in through an old cattle trail that curved east before cutting back toward the switching yard, avoiding the main road entirely. The cold was serious by now, the kind that made horses' breath show in long plumes, and froze the mud at the edges of the tracks into something that crunched under hooves. Evelyn's hand ached through the whole ride. She held the reins with her left and kept her right pressed against her coat. Caleb rode slightly ahead and to her left, which gave him a sight line on both the road and her without making it obvious he was watching either. The switching yard was lit with 2 lanterns near the main depot, and nothing else. Blackwood's policy, probably. Fewer lights meant fewer witnesses to what moved through. They tied the horses in a stand of scrub pine 50 yards from the yard fence and went the rest of the way on foot. Freight car 702 was exactly where the schedule put it, near the back of a coal train, separated from the main cars by a gap that looked accidental and wasn't. 2 guards stood at the front of the coal train. One more walked a slow circuit around the rear cars, not very alert, stepping in the same pattern each time. Caleb watched the circuit once, then again. 40 seconds between passes on the east side. There's a repair shed 20 feet north of 702, Evelyn said quietly. I need to check it. He looked at her. Portable relay equipment, she said. If Blackwood is running transmissions from this yard, he needs a secondary line and a power source. The shed is the right size and the right location. She paused. 40 seconds is enough. For one of us, he said. You watch the circuit guard. Signal me if the pattern changes. She went while the guard was on the far side. The shed was unlocked, which meant either no one expected anyone to look, or it was a different kind of trap. Evelyn filed both possibilities and kept moving. Inside, a portable relay unit, military model, connected to a wire that ran out through a hole in the back wall toward the main Blackwood cable. A battery pack still warm. A small logbook. She didn't take the logbook. She opened it. Read the last 3 entries in the dim light from the door, crack, memorized them, and set it back exactly as she'd found it. The last entry was a dispatch code she recognized. Train number, freight designation, a 3-letter sequence that Blackwood's hired gangs used to identify their contact on the receiving end. She also recognized the operator's rhythm from the marks on the test tape, still threaded through the relay. Same signature she'd been tracking since Denver. The person who'd helped arrange the staged robberies was sending from this shed. She sat down at the relay and found the receiving frequency. Then she did something that required more confidence than comfort. She sent a switching order in that operator's rhythm, not perfectly close enough to read direct attention, different enough that the real operator wouldn't own it if questioned later. Move detail to northwest platform. Signal from depot. She waited, listened. Through the shed wall, she heard footsteps change direction. Then voices, brief and compliant, moving away from 702. She was back beside Caleb in 30 seconds. Guards moved, she said. I noticed. He looked at her steadily. What did you send? A false order in a Blackwood operator's rhythm. They'll figure out it was wrong in about 10 minutes when no one meets them at the northwest platform. She was already moving towards 702. We have less than that. Caleb got the freight car door open. In under a minute, the lock was a railroad standard, and he had the right tool for it without her asking how he knew that. What was inside was not 12 railroad workers. It was 12 sets of chains, iron, heavy, sized for wrists and ankles, bolted to anchor rings on the floor in a row. 12 sets, empty. Beside each one, a railroad worker's identification card, issued by Blackwood Continental, stamped with a name and a number. And in the corner, stacked against the wall, empty ammunition crates, military grade, the kind that moved weapons, not coal. Evelyn crouched near the floor, careful with her hand, and looked at the chalk markings on the inside wall. Someone had drawn a rough map. She studied it in the thin light. This matches the Northern Canyon line, she said. This point here is Widowmaker Junction. She traced the marks with her eyes, and this date written on the left is 3 days from now. The next staged robbery, Caleb said, scheduled 3 days out, which means they have the workers somewhere already, and they've been planning the placement for weeks. She stood. The prisoners were moved before I even arrived in Red Hollow. This car was theater. Something for someone to find and report. Or something to pin on us, Caleb said. Then the locomotive at the front of the coal train groaned. Not the usual metal settling sound. This was movement. The train was rolling. Caleb looked toward the front of the yard. Someone released the brake. The coal cars began picking up speed, slow but committed, rolling south toward the passenger platform, where the night train from Cheyenne was still sitting on the adjacent track. Evelyn ran the math without thinking about it, the way other people ran simple arithmetic: speed, distance, the gap between tracks at the platform junction, the position of the passenger train's rear car, the location of the switching lever she'd spotted near the depot on their way in. Switch lever, north side of the depot, she said. It's frozen. It'll need both hands or 2 people. Caleb was already moving. She ran alongside him. The coal train was 30 yards behind them and gaining. At the platform, 2 passengers were still boarding the night train, unaware. The lever was iron and thick with ice. Caleb grabbed it with both hands and pulled. It didn't move. Evelyn grabbed with her left hand. Pain and useless. She shifted her grip and used the heel of her right palm instead, pushing rather than pulling, adding pressure below the joint where the bone was still solid. Two workers from the freight depot appeared at a run, reading the situation without being told. One grabbed the lever beside Caleb. The second braced against the post. The switch broke free with a sound like a gunshot. The track shifted. The coal train hit the redirect and rolled past the passenger platform onto the secondary freight line, slowing gradually, coming to a shuddering stop against the buffer at the far end of the yard. The passengers on the platform hadn't moved. One of them dropped a bag. Evelyn stood with her right hand pressed to her chest, breathing. Caleb turned to her. His face was controlled, but she could read what was underneath it, the particular tension of someone who had just watched a near disaster close itself by a very small margin. That was your calculation, he said. Our execution, she said. He accepted that. Didn't argue, didn't redirect it, just nodded. Then someone touched her arm light. Careful, not grabbing. She turned. Tomas Ortega was shorter than she'd imagined from the description in the identification cards. Late 40s, heavy through the shoulders, with a track worker's hands and a bruise along his jaw that was fresh enough to still be changing color. You're Shaw, he said. Not a question. Yes. He looked at Caleb briefly, then back at her. He hadn't decided about Caleb yet. That was reasonable. The 12 men, he said. We were separated 2 days ago. They took us off the main road before we reached Red Hollow. He was speaking quickly, watching the edges of the yard. There's a private branch line, runs east from the junction at Miller Creek. They put the others on a prison car headed. He stopped. 2 of Blackwood's guards had come around the side of the coal train, moving toward the disturbance. Evelyn saw them before Tomas did. She put her hand on his arm. Go now. East side of the yard, through the gap in the fence. He hesitated 1 second, looking at Caleb, making his decision about him. And then he went. The guards were faster. They had Tomas before he reached the fence. Evelyn stood still beside Caleb and watched, because running would accomplish nothing except getting them arrested too. Tomas didn't struggle. He looked back once, and his expression said something she understood without translation. He told you where to go. Now go there. She was already turning toward Caleb. Then she stopped. In the lamplight near the open freight car door, she could see inside 702 more clearly than before. The ammunition crates, the chains, the chalk markings on the wall, and on the inside base of the nearest crate, nailed flat against the wood with 2 square-headed tacks, a railroad security badge. She walked over and crouched down and looked at it without touching it. The name on the badge was faded but readable. Caleb went very still beside her. She looked up at him. His expression told her everything she needed to know before he said a single word. Neither of them spoke on the ride back. The badge was in Evelyn's coat pocket. She hadn't asked if she could take it. Caleb hadn't told her to leave it. They'd both understood, without discussion, that it needed to come with them, and that the conversation it would start could wait until they were off the road. The ranch was cold and dark when they arrived. Caleb lit the stove while Evelyn sat at the kitchen table. She placed the badge between them like a document requiring a signature. Caleb looked at it for a long moment. Then he sat down. I worked railroad security for 3 years after I left the Army, he said. Blackwood Continental was the largest contractor in the territory. Most security riders worked for them, whether they meant to or not. They controlled the freight lines, so they controlled who got hired to protect them. He paused. I wasn't working for Blackwood when I took the job. By the end, I couldn't say the same. Evelyn waited. There was a night ambush, he said. Northern Canyon Line. We'd had 3 robberies in 6 weeks on that stretch, all after dark, all the same method. Someone was feeding the robbers information about freight schedules. He looked at his hands on the table. My commanding officer told me the robbers had a contact signaling from the hillside, lantern signals. He said, if we saw a light on the eastern slope, it was the contact, and we should treat it as a threat. He stopped. We saw a light, he said, on the eastern slope, moving in short bursts. His voice stayed even with the effort of someone who had rehearsed the facts many times, but still hadn't made peace with them. I fired. The boy was 16. He was carrying a railroad messenger's bag and a signal lantern. Evelyn said nothing. The official investigation cleared me, Caleb said. My commanding officer testified that the boy's movements matched the robber contact pattern. The report said, I acted correctly under the circumstances. He finally looked up at her. 2 months later, I learned the boy's name, Daniel Shaw, nephew of the senior telegraph engineer at the Denver relay office. The kitchen was quiet, except for the stove. Amos knew, Evelyn said. I figured that. Eventually, she put both hands on the table, the wrapped one and the good one, and looked at him directly. Amos didn't want revenge. He spent a year trying to determine whether you knew the boy was innocent when you fired, whether you were Blackwood's man or Blackwood's mistake. She held his gaze. His conclusion was the second one. That's why he gave me your name. Caleb looked at her steadily. And what was your conclusion? She took a breath. That your letters were written by a man carrying guilt, not one hiding it. Guilty men defend themselves. You never did. You started writing to me to find that out. Yes, the word landed plainly. She didn't soften it. That would have been worse. Caleb was quiet for a long time. The fire in the stove made small sounds. Outside, the wind moved across the pasture. Correspondence, he said. The 6 months of letters. Was any of it? It became real, she said. I won't qualify that further. He nodded once, not forgiving her for it, not dismissing it, just taking it in. Then Sarah's wagon appeared in the yard. Sarah came in fast, which was not her usual speed. She put a folded paper on the table and didn't sit down. It was an arrest notice. Both their names. Accessory charges for Caleb, the original theft and murder accusations for Evelyn, and a new addition conspiracy to interfere with railroad operations. It's dated this morning, Sarah said. Blackwood had someone ride through the night to get it filed. She looked at Caleb. He also sent a message to your Army contacts. I don't know what it said. Caleb picked up the notice. Read it. Set it down. He's moving faster than I expected. He's scared, Evelyn said. Both of them looked at her. He wasn't scared before I arrived. He had the workers in custody and the next robbery planned, and everything moving on schedule. Something I know is making him accelerate. She paused. It's the operator identifications. He knows I can identify the people who sent those coded messages by their transmission rhythm. That's not something a judge dismisses easily. An expert witness who can name specific individuals by the way they use a telegraph key. Sarah absorbed that. He needs to discredit you before you can testify, or silence me before I reach anyone worth testifying to. Sarah left 10 minutes later, carrying nothing, and looking like a woman who'd made a delivery. At the door, she turned back. There's an abandoned railroad camp about 2 miles east. Caleb knows it. The original signal post is still standing. She looked at Evelyn. I mention it because some questions have physical answers. After she was gone, Evelyn looked at Caleb. Daniel's signal post. Yes, he said. I've never gone back. I think we should. The camp was exactly what the name suggested, a place that had been temporary, and then been forgotten. 3 structures, partially collapsed. Rusted equipment, a supply shed with no door, and at the eastern edge of the clearing, a wooden signal post still standing at the original height, with the iron bracket for a lantern mount still attached. Evelyn walked to it and stood at its base. She looked east toward the canyon wall. Then she turned and looked west toward where the train track ran. Where were you positioned that night? She asked. Caleb came to stand beside her. He oriented himself by the canyon line and the old track bed. Then he moved about 40 feet northwest and stopped. Here, approximately. Evelyn looked from the signal post to his position. Then she looked at the eastern slope of the canyon wall. From where you were standing, she said, this post and the eastern slope are almost the same angle. Yes, your commanding officer told you to watch the eastern slope for a contact signal. Yes, but this post faces the train line. She put her hand on the iron bracket. A boy warning a train holds his lantern toward the train, not toward the robbers. She looked at Caleb. He was signaling the passengers, not the gang. Your commanding officer knew that and told you the opposite. Caleb stood very still. You fired on information someone deliberately falsified, she said. That's not the same as firing on an innocent boy you knew was innocent. He's still dead. Yes, she said. He is. And Blackwood ordered the track, sabotage Daniel was trying to warn people about. The same sabotage that would have derailed a passenger train if Daniel hadn't tried to stop it. She paused. Amos knew that too. It's why he couldn't hate you. Caleb looked at the signal post for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, not relief, not absolution, but something quieter. The particular look of a person who has been carrying a story with a missing piece and has just been handed it. Then a rifle shot cracked across the clearing and kicked up dirt 6 feet to Evelyn's left. She dropped immediately, pulling her hand against her chest. Caleb was already moving, putting himself between her and the canyon wall, scanning the ridgeline. Closer. They were bracketing 2 shooters, adjusting position. Shed, Caleb said. They ran. Another shot hit the signal post as they cleared the open ground. Inside the shed, there were gaps in the walls, but the angle was wrong for the shooters on the ridge. They'd have to move to the canyon floor to get a clean line, which would take time. Evelyn looked around the shed. Old equipment, mostly rusted. A signal lamp in the corner, the glass cracked but the reflector intact. Oil in the base, maybe a quarter full. I need a light source, she said. Caleb had a match. He watched the gaps in the walls while she worked. The signal lamp lit on the 3rd try. The flame was small, but the reflector caught it and threw a directed beam. Evelyn angled it toward the ridge and began moving it in a deliberate sequence. Not Morse code, something older, a railroad emergency pattern that predated the telegraph used by line workers before the wires went up. Long, short, long pause, repeated. It didn't mean anything specific. It was designed to confuse, to make anyone watching believe a signal was being sent that they weren't equipped to read. On the ridge, the shooting stopped. People stopped shooting when they thought they might be missing something important. It was a reliable feature of uncertainty. South Trail, Caleb said quietly, if we move now while they're repositioning. Evelyn put out the lamp. Go. They went south, through the scrub, staying low, using the collapsed structures as cover until the trail opened up. The horses were where they'd left them. No one followed them onto the south road. A mile out from the camp, Caleb's posture changed slightly, less rigid. That lamp? Signal, where did you learn that? Amos, he called it the oldest telegraph. She held her right hand against her coat. He said before the wires, light was the only long-distance language that didn't require a runner. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You used their own uncertainty against them. Uncertainty is the most reliable tool I have, she said. I can't outshoot anyone, but I can make them hesitate. Back at the ranch, Sarah's second visit of the day was already waiting. She'd arrived while they were gone and left a note under the door. Evelyn unfolded it. It was a fragment, transcribed in Sarah's careful handwriting. A partial transmission Sarah had intercepted through her own emergency equipment at the post office. The signal had been brief and then cut off. Evelyn read it. 12 men. 1 prison train. Execution is not the real plan. She read it twice. Then she looked at Caleb. Tomas managed to send before they caught him, she said. Caleb read the fragment. Execution is not the real plan. He looked up. Then what is? Evelyn set the paper on the desk. Her mind was already moving through the information. She had the ammunition crates, the chalk markings on the freight car wall, the false departure schedule, the accelerating timeline. I don't know yet, she said. But Blackwood doesn't keep 12 witnesses alive unless he needs them for something specific. She thought about the date on the freight car wall, 3 days out. Whatever the real plan was, it was already in motion. Evelyn spread the private rail schedule on the kitchen table and put a lamp close enough to read the small print. She'd been staring at the livestock manifest for 20 minutes before she found it, not in what was listed, but in what was absent. A livestock transfer of the size listed 40 head, Moving north would require a water stop at Miller Creek Junction. The manifest showed no water stop scheduled because there were no animals. They're moving the prisoners on this trains, she said. Livestock designation means fewer inspections and no passenger manifest requirements. The car numbers are consistent with the branch line configuration. Sarah mentioned short frame, heavy gauge, used for mountain runs. Caleb looked at the schedule over her shoulder. Departure from Miller Creek at dawn. Which gives us, she checked the clock, 5 hours to reach the branch line and find the train before it moves into the canyon. She looked at him. If the workers are on that train when it enters the northern cut, we lose them. The canyon has no accessible road once the track curves east. Caleb was already at the coat rack. Can you ride in this cold? I rode here from Denver with a crushed hand, she said. I'll manage. The branch line followed a creek bed east before climbing into the foothills, and the trail that ran beside it was narrow and not kind to horses after dark. Ice had formed along the edges of the creek. The cold came off the water and made the air feel sharper than the temperature alone accounted for. Evelyn rode with her right hand inside her coat and her left managing the reins. Caleb set a pace that was fast enough to matter and slow enough that she could maintain it, and he did it, without announcing that was what he was doing. She appreciated the absence of announcement. They found Tomas Ortega 2 miles up the trail. He was sitting against a boulder at the edge of the track bed, his left leg stretched out at an angle that explained why he'd stopped moving. He'd wrapped his own belt around his thigh above a laceration that was still seeping through the leather. He looked up when they came around the bend. His expression ran through several things quickly before settling on relief. You followed the branch line, he said. Your signal was enough, Evelyn said. She was off her horse before Caleb and crouching beside him, checking the wound by feel rather than sight. How long ago? Hour, maybe more. He looked at Caleb and something guarded moved through his expression. Your Mercer? Yes, Caleb said. Tomas held that for a moment. The name meant something to him clearly. He didn't say what. Can you ride? Caleb asked. Not fast. You don't need to be fast. You need to be on a horse. Caleb helped him up with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who'd moved injured people before and knew that extended gentleness wasn't always the useful thing. They found a maintenance cabin a quarter mile up the line, a single-room structure used by track repair crews, unlocked because no one expected anyone to need it in October. Caleb got Tomas inside and elevated the leg. Evelyn went for the telegraph wire. There was a line testing device in her satchel, a small, direct contact tool that Amos had built for her, designed to let an operator tap into a live wire without a formal connection point. It required a steady hand and a good ear. She found the line running along the trackside poles and made contact. The wire was active. She listened. 2 transmissions, overlapping a routine freight clearance, and something underneath it, moving in the abbreviated code she'd learned to identify as Blackwood's internal system. She filtered out the freight clearance and focused on the compressed signal beneath. She caught most of it, enough. She came back inside. Caleb looked at her face. The prisoners aren't being transported to a new jail, she said. Blackwood is planning a staged escape attempt. He'll claim they overpowered the guards. The guards will kill them. She paused. All of them. 12 men listed as killed while attempting escape, which closes the investigation and eliminates the witnesses. Tomas said something quiet and sharp in Spanish. There's more, Evelyn said. The guards who participate in the staged attack, they're being moved afterward to another assignment. Blackwood's next gold train. The same men who know about the staged robberies will be placed together on a single train. She looked at Caleb. He's consolidating his liabilities. Caleb understood what that meant before she finished saying it. He's going to kill them too. A different incident, different location. But yes, Tomas looked between them. How many men are on that prison train right now? 12 workers and a guard detail, Evelyn said. We can't reach all of them. but we might be able to slow the train long enough to get some of them off before it reaches the canyon. Caleb was already thinking through the track configuration. She could tell, by the way, his attention went slightly inward. There's an obstruction flag protocol. If the line ahead is reported blocked, the engineer is required to slow to a crawl and sound 3 warnings before proceeding. I can send a false obstruction warning, Evelyn said. It won't stop the train, but it'll buy us time. Tomas pushed himself upright against the wall. The rear brake linkage on that prison car, I helped install the same model 2 years ago, on the southern line. There's a manual release point, accessible from the outside of the car, if you know where to look. Caleb looked at him. Can you talk me through it? I can do better than that, Tomas said. Evelyn sent the obstruction warning from the line testing device, while Caleb and Tomas moved up the track. The signal went out in the standard format, clean enough to read as authentic, and 3 minutes later, she heard the train's whistle respond 2 short, 1 long. Engineer acknowledging obstruction protocol. The train slowed. She packed the testing device and ran. The prison car was at the rear of the train, exactly where the manifest put it. Caleb was already at the exterior panel Tomas had described, working with a tool from his horse kit. Tomas stood at the edge of the track, directing him in short, precise instructions. Caleb got the panel open. He pulled himself onto the moving car. Evelyn stayed on the ground and watched the front of the train. The engineer would stop the crawl in approximately 4 minutes when no obstruction appeared. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, Caleb dropped back to the track bed with 3 men beside him. They landed hard and rolled on the frozen ground and came up moving. Not 12. 3. Caleb's face said he knew. The front half of the car has a secondary lock, he said. He was breathing hard. Different mechanism. I couldn't reach it before the guard detail noticed the panel. The train was picking up speed again. In the distance, someone aboard was shouting. The 3 rescued workers were on their feet. One of them had a fresh bruise across his jaw and a railroad worker's hands, and the posture of someone accustomed to being in charge of things. He looked at Evelyn. You're the telegraph operator, he said. Tomas sent word about you. Yes, she said. Then you need to know what Blackwood's next target is. He looked back at the disappearing train. It's not a freight train. It's not a gold transfer. He paused. He's going to rob and destroy his own gold train. Collect the insurance, blame the workers, and eliminate anyone who was involved in the staged robberies. Evelyn went very still. There's a passenger car attached to Gold Train, the worker said. 30 people. Maybe more. Caleb looked at her. She looked at the track where the prison train had gone, carrying 9 men into a canyon with no road access. The calculation was simple and terrible. They'd saved 3. 9 remained, and somewhere on a train she didn't yet have a schedule for. 30 passengers had no idea what was coming. She looked at Caleb. We can't leave. No, he said. I know the route, he said. I rode security on it twice in the old contract. He paused. And I know Widowmaker Bridge. She looked at him. If he's going to destroy the train, Caleb said quietly, that's where he'll do it. One of the workers crouched down beside the track. He picked something up, a small stone. Nothing, and turned it over in his hand. Then he looked up at Caleb with the same guarded expression Tomas had used. You're going to help finish this? He said. Caleb held the man's gaze. Yes. The worker looked at him for a long moment. Whatever he was measuring, he seemed to reach an answer. Then you'll need to know this, he said. Before they transferred us, I heard one of Blackwood's men talking. He set the stone down. They've already placed explosives beneath Widowmaker Bridge. The cold moved through the air between all of them. The gold train departs in 2 days, he said. Evelyn looked at Caleb. He looked at her. Around them, the frozen branch line ran east into the dark, carrying 9 men toward something they couldn't stop tonight. But they could stop what came next. She reached into her coat with her left hand and touched the brass key on its chain. It was cold from the night air and small and solid. We need to get back to Red Hollow, she said, and we need a different plan. The fire started before dawn. Evelyn woke to the smell first, that particular combination of burning hay and hot wood that doesn't belong in a sleeping house. She was dressed and out the door in under a minute, and what she saw stopped her on the porch steps. The main stable was fully involved. Flames pushed through the roof seams and lit the yard orange. The horses were screaming. Caleb was already there, ahead of her, working the main door with his shoulder. The latch had warped from the heat and wasn't moving cleanly. He got it open on the third attempt, and the horses came through in a rush, 4, 5, 6 of them, not waiting, not needing direction, just moving away from the heat as fast as 4 legs would carry them. Evelyn ran for the water barrel at the corner of the yard. Empty. She found a second one near the fence line, this one half full, and started hauling it toward the structure. Miriam appeared from the direction of the road. She'd seen the light from town and come without being asked. One of the rescued workers, staying in the bunkhouse since last night, came out, pulling his boots on. "Bucket line," Evelyn said. "From the creek pump. Miriam, take the middle position. Your arms are stronger than mine right now." Nobody questioned the arrangement. They just moved into it. Evelyn worked with her left hand and used her right forearm to pass rather than grip. The pain was significant, and she noted it the way she noted weather present, relevant, not a reason to stop. The line moved water from the creek pump to the stable in a rhythm that was almost enough, almost in time, almost capable of saving the structure. It wasn't. The roof came down on the east side before they'd made a real difference. But the horses were out. All of them scattered across the pasture and the road, but alive and movable. That was the thing that mattered. When it was over, when the fire had consumed what it was going to consume, and they'd stopped what they could stop. Evelyn sat on the fence rail and looked at what was left. Charred beams, the stone foundation, intact. The smell that would be there for weeks. Caleb stood at the edge of the yard with ash on his coat and his hands at his sides. He didn't say anything for a while. She didn't either. 3 horses unaccounted for, he said finally. The stable, the tack room, half my equipment. A pause. The telegraph machine was in the study. That's gone too. Evelyn looked at the house. The study window faced the stable. The heat alone could have damaged the sounder. And if someone had come through the yard during the confusion. "I know," she said. Miriam came to stand near them. Her coat had a scorch mark along the sleeve. "Nobody's injured. That's the first thing." "Yes," Caleb said. He meant it. By mid-morning, Blackwood's notice had reached the ranch by way of a rider who left it at the gate without stopping. Evelyn read it standing in the yard. The language was formal, and Public Blackwood extending an offer of resolution. If Caleb surrendered Evelyn Shaw to Blackwood Continental Railroad Security for questioning, all accusations against Caleb Mercer would be dropped. His contracts would be restored. His name would be cleared. She handed it to Caleb without comment. He read it, set it on the fence post. "No, you haven't thought about it." "I don't need to," he looked at her. "That's not a serious offer. It's a document designed to be found later, after whatever he plans to do to you, so he can claim he tried to resolve things peacefully." He picked the notice up again and folded it and put it in his coat pocket. "We keep it. It's evidence of contact." Evelyn studied him. "Your contracts are gone. Your stable is gone. He's going to take the railroad horse work too. That's already in motion, I'd guess, probably. That's your income, Caleb. I know what it is." He looked at her steadily. "I also know what it isn't. It isn't a reason to hand you to a man who crushed your hand to prove a point." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, not because she was uncomfortable, but because she needed to think without his expression in her direct sightline. Sarah arrived an hour later with news and a train ticket. She set the ticket on the kitchen table between them, eastbound, departing that afternoon. Evelyn's name wasn't on it, which was the point. "There's a seat reserved," Sarah said. "The conductor owes me a significant favor and has a short memory about faces." She sat down. "It gets you to Cheyenne. From there, you have options." Caleb looked at the ticket, then at Evelyn. "It's a clean way out. before the warrant is formalized. Evelyn looked at the ticket. The workers have enough information now, Caleb continued, between what Tomas knows and what we've documented, a federal investigator. A federal investigator arrives after the gold train departs, Evelyn said, after the bridge, after 30 passengers. She kept her voice level, after 9 men in a prison car are listed as killed during an escape attempt. You've already done more than anyone could have asked. She picked up the ticket, looked at it. He was doing it again, the thing he did when he was frightened, which was to make a decision for her and present it as consideration. She recognized it now. She wasn't angry about it the way she might have been 2 weeks ago. She understood where it came from. That didn't make it right. She put the ticket in her pocket and stood up. I'm going to the station. Caleb and Sarah exchanged a brief look. Evelyn caught it. I'll be back before the train leaves, she said. I need to use the public telegraph desk. The Red Hollow station had replaced its operators. She'd expected that. 2 men she didn't recognize were working the desk, both wearing Blackwood Company badges on their coats. They watched her come in with the careful attention of people who'd been given a description. She went to the public window, which was legally required to remain accessible, regardless of company control. It was a small but important distinction. Blackwood owned the station, but he didn't own the public wire. Not yet. She paid for a standard message and wrote it out left-handed in the deliberate block letters of a routine transmission. The operator on duty read it, found nothing alarming in the surface content, and sent it. What he sent was a message about a delayed postal delivery, in plain language, to a station 3 stops east. What he also sent, embedded in the timing gaps between each letter gaps, that were too precise to be casual and too subtle to be obvious to someone not trained to hear them, was an emergency code. A pattern Amos had taught her, a signal that said, to anyone who knew how to listen, I am in danger. I am being monitored. Watch for my next transmission. Independent operators along the Eastern Line had learned this pattern from Amos over 30 years. At least 3 of them would hear it. She walked back to the ranch. Caleb was at the gate when she came up the road. He'd been watching for her. She could tell by the particular way his posture changed when he saw her coming relief first, then something he quickly organized into a neutral expression. She stopped in front of him. I'm not getting on that train, she said. He absorbed this all right, but I want you to hear something first. She looked at him directly. I understand why you arranged that ticket. I know it came from care, not from wanting me gone. But deciding what's safest for me without asking me, that's the same logic Blackwood used when he decided my testimony was too dangerous to allow. She paused. The action is different. The assumption underneath it isn't. Caleb was quiet for a moment. His expression didn't get defensive, it got thoughtful. You're right, he said. I should have asked. Yes. What do you want to do? She looked at the burned shell of the stable, then back at him. I want to stop the gold train, free the remaining workers, and make sure Blackwood's name is attached to every crime he's committed in a way that survives him trying to burn the evidence. She paused. And I want us to make the plan together. He held the gate open. Come inside. They worked through it at the kitchen table with the rescued workers and Sarah and Miriam. The plan that emerged was built on established pieces, Evelyn's coded transmissions, Caleb's knowledge of the Widowmaker junction configuration, Tomas's understanding of the track-switching equipment, Sarah's network of independent operators. The canyon signal tower was the critical point. Whoever controlled it could redirect trains and manage the junction switches. If they could reach the tower before Blackwood's men secured it for the gold train run, they had a chance. Sarah refilled her coffee and set the cup down. Blackwood has replaced every operator in Red Hollow with company men, she said. The main telegraph line runs through his station. Any signal I send from the post office goes through his filters first. The independent line bypasses his station, Evelyn said. If you can keep that channel open during the operation, I can do that. Sarah paused. As long as no one physically stops me. We'll need people at the junction as well, one of the rescued workers said. He looked at Caleb. The manual switch at Widowmaker, it takes 2 people in cold weather. The mechanism freezes, Caleb nodded. I know the switch. I've worked it before. The plan was nearly complete when the telegraph sounder at the post office. Sarah had brought a small portable unit connected to the independent line, came to life on the table. Evelyn leaned forward. The message came through in Amos's borrowed rhythm. She transcribed it as it arrived. Do not trust the signal tower. Blackwood knows your plan. She read it aloud. The room went quiet. He's inside our communication, Caleb said. He's been inside it since before I arrived. Evelyn looked at the transcription. But this message, the operator is warning us. Blackwood doesn't warn people. He acts. She looked up. Silas Crow stepped through the back door with a revolver in his hand, pointed at the floor rather than at anyone. A meaningful distinction. He stopped just inside the threshold and let them all look at him. He was broad, mid-30s, with the kind of face that had made a lot of hard calculations and showed the record of them. He looked at Evelyn first. I need 5 minutes, he said, and I'm not here to collect you. Nobody moved for a long moment. Crow kept the revolver pointed down, and his eyes on Evelyn, with the directness of someone who had decided honesty, was his only remaining option. The messages using Amos Shaw's call sign, he said. That was me. Evelyn already knew. She'd been waiting for the confirmation. You took his codebook during the attack. Yes, he didn't embellish it, Blackwood ordered the attack. I was there. I didn't know what he was going to do until it was already done. He paused. That's not an excuse. It's a sequence of events. Caleb's hand was near his coat. Not moving. Watching. Why the warnings? Evelyn asked. Crow looked at her with the expression of a man who didn't enjoy explaining himself, but had run out of alternatives. Because Blackwood is planning to clean up after himself. Everyone who participated in the staged robberies, the guards, the hired gang, they're being consolidated onto the gold train. He paused. I'm on that list. So your loyalty has a survival limit, Caleb said. Most do. Crow didn't flinch from it. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm offering a trade. The signal tower access schedule and the guard rotation for tonight in exchange for a head start after. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She looked at Crow. If the information is accurate, she said, I won't spend any effort locating you after. That's what I can offer. Crow considered it. He reached into his coat with his free hand slowly, watching Caleb, and produced a folded paper. He set it on the table. Caleb unfolded it. Read it. His expression stayed even. He pushed it toward Evelyn. It was the signal tower schedule. Guard positions, rotation times, the access window that Blackwood's men would be watching, and the one they wouldn't. It looked accurate. It matched what she'd already calculated from the rail schedule. There's something else, Crow said. The bridge explosion is controlled from Blackwood's private train car. There's a detonation box. He's not leaving it to someone else. Evelyn looked up. He'll be on the train personally, Crow said. He doesn't trust anyone else to time it correctly. After Crow left through the same door, he'd come in, accepting nothing from them, moving with the speed of a man who'd already said more than was comfortable. The room held the information he'd delivered and turned it over. The plan needed adjustment. The signal tower was compromised. Blackwood would be expecting them to move on it, he said. Blackwood knows our plan, Sarah said. He knows the outline, Evelyn said, not the specifics. If he knew everything, Crow would already be dead, and we'd have more company than one man through the back door. She looked at Caleb. He was already thinking through the adjustments, she could tell. But there was something else in his face, a particular tension that she recognized now as the one he wore when he was deciding to do something alone. She'd gotten good at reading it. Whatever you're planning, she said, say it out loud. He looked at her. I'm going to the tower tonight. If I go alone, I can move faster, and there's less risk to— No, she said, Evelyn. We made a plan together 2 hours ago. She kept her voice level. That plan exists because I'm in it. You approach that tower without knowing which transmission will redirect the train, and you've got a building and a switch, and nothing to do with them. Caleb put both hands flat on the table. He was quiet for a moment, genuinely processing it, not waiting for her to finish so he could argue. I know what it costs me if something happens to you, he said. I can't pretend I don't. Then don't pretend. She held his gaze, acknowledge it, and come up with something better than sending me away. The room was very quiet. Sarah looked at the table. Miriam looked at her coffee cup. Caleb looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of a man who has just run out of protective distance to put between himself and the truth. I can't survive causing another innocent death, he said. That's what this is. That's what it's always been. I make a call, someone dies because I was wrong, and I have spent 8 years trying to arrange circumstances so that can never happen again. His voice stayed level, but the weight under it was audible. The ranch, the isolation, even this. He paused. You asked me once why I kept your letters. It's because reading them was the only hour of any given day that I didn't feel like I was already a verdict. Evelyn was still for a moment. Fear doesn't give you the right to choose for everyone, she said. It's a reason to be careful, not a reason to be alone. He absorbed that without deflecting it. I'm not staying for the workers, she said. I mean, I am, but that's not the only reason. She held his gaze. You know that. Something shifted in his face, not breaking, settling. The particular look of something that had been held against pressure, finally being allowed to rest. He came around the table. The first time he touched her face, it was with the back of his hand very briefly, checking without asking if it was allowed. She turned slightly toward it rather than away. That was answer enough. He kissed her once, carefully. The way a person does something they've been thinking about for longer than they've admitted and want to do correctly. She kissed him back with her good hand, pressed flat against his chest, feeling his heart moving faster than his expression would suggest. Sarah found something to look at in the middle distance. When they separated, neither of them made commentary on it. The situation remained exactly as serious as it had been 30 seconds earlier. We go together, Caleb said. We use Crow's schedule. Yes, Evelyn said. Crow had been more specific than she'd given him credit for. The access window was real. She could see that from the way the guard positions were distributed, one heavy cluster at the main approach, a gap of 11 minutes on the eastern side that Blackwood's men had created by doubling up coverage at the front without adjusting the rear. They moved on that gap, the 4 of them, Evelyn, Caleb, and 2 of the rescued workers, who knew the terrain, came in from the creek side using the cattle trail she'd memorized from the ranch approach 2 weeks ago. They were 40 yards from the tower's eastern door when Crow appeared at the edge of the tree line. Evelyn's first thought was, the schedule was accurate. Her second thought arrived a half-second later when she saw the number of men behind him, 8 guards, moving fast. Crow's face carried something she couldn't immediately read. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something more complicated. The shot came from the ridgeline, not from Crow's direction. It hit Caleb in the left shoulder and spun him sideways into the underbrush. Evelyn moved toward him. A guard reached her before she could reach Caleb, catching her arm, her right arm, her damaged arm, and the pain was immediate and total. And she made a sound she hadn't intended to make. She was still making calculations. Even then, even through the white edge of the pain. Caleb was moving. Down, but not still. He'd gotten himself behind a fallen trunk and wasn't making a target of himself. The 2 workers had scattered into the tree line. The guard pulling her toward the road was not Crow. Crow stood at the edge of the lamplight from the tower and didn't touch her. He met her eyes once. His expression said something she filed for later. Then he moved toward her, deliberately, and she thought for a moment he was going to take her himself. Instead, he pressed something into her injured hand, small, metal, cold from the night air. Amos's brass telegraph key. She closed her fingers around it before the guard could see. They put her in a covered wagon, and the tower disappeared behind the tree line and she could hear, distantly, one of the workers calling Caleb's name with enough urgency to tell her he was still there and still alive. She held the key in her fist and breathed and thought. The wagon moved east, toward the railroad line. She could tell from the sound of the wheels on the grade. Blackwood's private train car. She'd known, on some level, since the moment Crow had first appeared at the back door, that this was a possible outcome. Crow's loyalty had a survival limit. He'd told them that himself. What she hadn't known was that survival and a single act of conscience could coexist in the same man, without either canceling the other out. She looked at the brass key in her palm. He'd given her the one thing she needed. Now she needed Caleb to trust her long enough to use it. Blackwood's private train car smelled like cedar and lamp oil, and the particular staleness of a space where power had been held long enough to become comfortable. Evelyn sat across from him at a narrow table, bolted to the floor. The table had a telegraph key on it. That told her everything she needed to know about what came next. Blackwood was 60, or near enough, silver-haired, well-dressed, with the careful grooming of a man who understood that appearance was its own kind of argument. He looked at her with the measured patience of someone who had learned that waiting cost him nothing. "You have a recognizable transmission rhythm," he said. "Every operator who's worked with you knows it. Every station between Denver and Cheyenne has received messages in your signature." He adjusted his cufflink. "That's actually quite useful to me." Evelyn said nothing. "Before midnight," he said, "you will tell every station that these men confessed." She looked at the telegraph key, then at him. "My hand is damaged. You know that your men arranged it, then you'll dictate. I have an operator." He nodded toward the door, connecting to the next car. "He'll send what you tell him to send, in whatever rhythm you provide." She understood the structure of it immediately. She'd dictate slowly, citing pain, citing difficulty. The operator would follow her pace. And in that pace, in the spaces between letters, in the deliberate hesitations, she could control. She could put something else entirely. Amos had taught her that a telegraph message had two layers, the surface and the signal. Most people only listen to the surface. "All right," she said. Blackwood studied her. He'd expected more resistance. She could see him recalibrating. "I'll need frequent pauses," she said. "The pain affects my concentration. Take whatever time you need." He smiled, with the confidence of a man who had never once considered that patience could be used against him, "as long as the message is complete, before we reach the junction." The operator came in young, nervous, clearly understanding. He was involved in something he hadn't fully agreed to when he took the job. He sat at the key. Evelyn positioned herself beside him and began to dictate. She gave him the confession text Blackwood had written out. Standard language, worker names, dates, admission of robbery, names of supposed accomplices, clean and damning. And she told it to him slowly. Between each word, she inserted a pause. A half beat too long here, a double beat before a number there. The errors accumulated in a pattern that looked like pain and concentration if you weren't listening for what it actually was. Sarah would hear it. Sarah had spent 3 years learning Amos's emergency code in the back room of the Red Hollow post office on Tuesday evenings when the mail was sorted and the front window was locked. Sarah had been Amos's student before Evelyn had. She'd know the errors weren't errors. Evelyn kept her voice steady and her eyes on the middle distance and built the real message inside the false one. Gold train, Widowmaker Junction, bridge damaged, 9 men in rear freight car. Passengers at risk. She repeated the junction name twice, embedded in different words. She put the train number in the pauses between the worker names. She made the bridge warning sound like a hesitation before the word robbery. Blackwood stood at the window and watched the dark landscape pass. He wasn't listening to the rhythm. That was his limitation. He understood power as a blunt instrument. Control the line, control the message. He'd never worked a key in his life. She was 4 paragraphs into the confession when the operator stopped. He looked at his transmission record, then at her, His expression had changed. Evelyn held very still. The operator was young, but he wasn't stupid. He'd been trained well enough to notice that the timing pattern she'd given him was internally consistent in a way that pain and concentration didn't produce. Inconsistency looked random. What she'd given him was structured. He'd realized he was carrying two messages. He looked at Blackwood's back, then at Evelyn. She held his gaze without expression, giving him nothing that could be used against him, giving him the choice. He put his hands back on the key. He sent the next paragraph exactly as she dictated it. Evelyn exhaled slowly. Blackwood turned from the window. "How much more?" "2 paragraphs," she said. "My hand, take a moment?" She took a moment. In that moment, she assessed the car. The door to the rear freight cars was to her left. Through it, somewhere behind the connecting platforms and the guard car, were 9 men in chains. She'd seen them when she was brought aboard, a glimpse through the door gap before it closed, enough to confirm Tomas wasn't among them. He was still somewhere on the branch line, injured but free. The locking pin on the freight car connection was mechanical. If it was the same model as the configuration Tomas had described, it could be accessed from the interior corridor. She needed to finish the transmission first. She dictated the last 2 paragraphs and built the final piece of the warning into the closing signature. The timing of the junction, the speed the train was running, the margin before the bridge. The operator sent it. Blackwood took the transmission record and read it. He nodded. Good. Then he read it again. Evelyn watched his expression. The first read was for content. The second was for something else. He hadn't heard the rhythm, he couldn't, but something in the structure had caught his attention. He looked at her. "You put something in this. I dictated what you gave me. You added something." He set the record down. His patience had converted into something colder. "What did you send?" She said nothing. He reached across the table and closed his hand over her right wrist, not crushing, not yet. But the pressure was deliberate and specific. A reminder. "What did you send?" he said again. The connecting door opened before she answered. Crow came through it, moving with the careful speed of a man who'd made a decision and was committed to the consequences. He had a hand pressed against his side where something had happened recently, a fresh wound, dark through his shirt. He was still standing. That was what mattered. "The ammunition car," he said to Blackwood. "You attached it directly behind the explosive car." He stopped in the center of the room. That wasn't in the plan. Blackwood looked at him with the expression of a man who had been managing liabilities long enough to recognize one turning. The configuration changed. The configuration changed so that if anything goes wrong near the bridge, the ammunition car goes with it. Crow's voice was even, along with everyone inside it. He looked at Blackwood directly. "That's us. That's the guards. That's your own hired men. Silas." "I've been doing your work for 6 years," Crow said. "I've looked the other way on things I shouldn't have. I've made that accounting with myself. But I'm not going to stand in an ammunition car while you detonate a bridge from a private rail car half a mile behind it." Blackwood moved his hand toward the inside of his coat. Crow shot him in the arm before the hand completed the motion. The sound in the enclosed car was enormous. Blackwood went sideways into the window frame and stayed there, gripping his arm, his expression moving through shock toward calculation. Evelyn was already at the connecting door. She had 30 seconds before the guards in the next car came through. She found the locking pin on the freight car, coupling in the corridor, same model, same location. Tomas had described and worked it with her left hand. It was stiff. She used the brass telegraph key as a lever, pressing it sideways into the mechanism, and felt something give. The pin released. Behind her, Crow and Blackwood were still in the car. She heard voices from the guard car. She moved back into the corridor and pulled the connecting door shut and held it with her weight. The transmission was out. Sarah had it. The independent operators had it. All she needed was for Caleb to be at the junction when the train arrived. She'd trusted him to be there. That was the thing she kept returning to as the train moved through the dark. She'd trusted him to recognize her signal, to follow their plan rather than abandon it to come after her, to be exactly where she needed him to be at exactly the right moment. That was what trust actually meant, not the feeling, but the action. Betting on someone's judgment when you couldn't supervise the outcome. In the guard car, she heard the prisoners. She couldn't see them through the door, but she could hear the particular sound of men working at something metal in the dark. Methodical, patient, the sound of people who understood that panic wasted energy and that careful effort was the only currency that spent. Crow had given them a tool. Even wounded, even calculating his own survival, he'd done that much. The train hit the junction approach, and the whistle blew two short, one long. The engineer had received the obstruction warning. He was slowing. Not enough to stop, but enough. Evelyn looked through the corridor window at the dark canyon wall passing outside. The fog was heavy, here genuine, November fog, that turned the lantern light at the signal tower into a smeared glow half a mile ahead. The tower wasn't responding to the train's approach signal. She felt the floor shift slightly. The freight car behind her was changing its relationship to the train. The pin had worked. The rear cars were beginning to separate from Blackwood's private car on the grade. Somewhere ahead, in the fog, she needed Caleb to be at the manual switch. She pressed her hand flat against the cold corridor window and looked at the canyon. Then she picked up the brass key and found the train's internal signal wire running along the corridor wall, exposed at a junction box 6 feet from where she stood. She had one transmission left in her. She made it count. The switch at Widowmaker Junction was a lever system designed to redirect trains from the main canyon line onto the abandoned quarry spur. In fair weather, one person could move it in under a minute. In October fog with ice on the mechanism, it was a different problem entirely. Caleb had been working it for 6 minutes. Tomas was beside him, moving despite the leg, using his weight on the lower arm of the lever while Caleb worked the upper mechanism. 2 of the rescued workers held lanterns and watched the approach line for the train's headlamp. The fog made everything 50 feet out invisible. The switching plate is thrown to the rail bed, Tomas said. He wasn't panicking. He was diagnosing, which was more useful. The pin housing is clear. It's the plate itself. Caleb looked at his horse, standing in the scrub 20 feet back. He thought about the leather harness, the heavy connecting straps, the iron buckle hardware. Hold the lever, he said. He went to the horse and stripped 2 long harness sections. The buckles were solid iron, the straps heavy enough for draft work. He brought them back and threaded the strap end under the switching plate's lower edge, looping the buckle through as an anchor. When I say, he said. Tomas understood without further explanation. He put both hands on the lever arm and nodded. Now, Caleb said. He pulled the harness strap at the angle that would lift the plate while Tomas drove the lever. Something resisted, then gave not cleanly, not easily, but enough. The switching plate broke free from the ice. The mechanism moved. One of the workers dropped his lantern and grabbed the lever with Tomas to finish the arc. The track shifted. In the distance, the train whistle blew 2 short. 1 long. The engineer was slowing for the obstruction warning. Caleb could hear the change in the engine sound, even through the fog. Then Blackwood's guards came out of the tree line, 4 of them, moving fast from the eastern approach, where the signal tower access path met the junction clearing. They'd been positioned there in advance. Waiting, Tomas looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the guards. He did the math 4 against 6, but his people were on the wrong side of the lever and couldn't leave it without the switch moving back. Hold the switch, Caleb said to the workers. Whatever happens, hold it. He moved toward the guards and put himself between them and the lever mechanism. The guard in front raised a rifle. Caleb stopped. The fog moved between them like something deliberate. He could see the man's face at this distance. He could see his hands. He could see which way the rifle was angled high. A warning position, not yet committed to the shot. He did not draw his own weapon. He waited. This was the thing he'd learned at cost, the difference between a certain target and an uncertain one. He'd fired on uncertainty once. He would not do it again. The guard took a step forward, then another, measuring Caleb's stillness. Then a sound came from the tracks behind them, a sharp, percussive crack, like a pin releasing under pressure, followed by the groan of coupling metal separating. Everyone turned. The rear freight cars were detaching from the front of the train, moving independently on the grade, slower than the main cars, the separation visible even in the fog as a gap opening between the locomotive section and the rear. From inside the freight car, someone was hitting the door with something heavy and rhythmic. The guards looked at the train, at each other, at Caleb. One of them broke toward the freight car at a run. The others held their positions for exactly the wrong number of seconds, distracted, uncertain. And Tomas hit the nearest one from behind with the full weight of a man who had spent 30 years handling railroad iron. The workers left the lever and moved. It was not clean or organized. It was 4 men who'd been in chains 2 days ago. Discovering that the guards were suddenly outnumbered and undersupported in the fog, at a junction nobody else was watching. The guards had better weapons. The workers had better reasons. Caleb took the rifle from the man he'd been watching not by force, by speed, stepping inside the man's reach before the rifle could be leveled, and that was the moment the balance shifted. Inside the freight car, the door came open. 9 men came out. Some of them could barely stand. They came out anyway. Caleb looked at the train. The locomotive and passenger cars were still moving on the main line, headed for the damaged bridge. The freight cars were slowing on the grade, drifting toward the junction. He needed the switch to hold. He went back to the lever and put his weight on it. The freight cars rolled through the switched junction and began moving down the quarry spur line slower, angled correctly, moving away from the bridge. In Blackwood's private car, somewhere on the main line section, was a detonation box. Caleb looked at the fog where the train had disappeared and waited for the sound of the bridge. The sound didn't come. He waited longer. The fog moved. The quarry spur groaned with the weight of the slowing freight cars. The 9 freed workers stood in the junction clearing and breathed the cold air. The bridge did not detonate. Inside the signal car, Evelyn had found Blackwood at the detonation box with one good arm and enough fury to work with it. She'd come through the corridor connection after Crow's shot, moving toward the signal equipment rather than away from it, because the bridge detonation control was wired into the signal car's electrical system. She'd seen the wiring configuration when she was first brought aboard a junction box above the forward window. Military style, designed to send a current on command. Blackwood had reached it before her. He had the control box open and his one functional hand on the trigger mechanism when Evelyn came through the door. She crossed the car in 4 steps and drove Amos's brass key into the open junction box sideways, jamming it between the contact plate and the trigger wire. The key was small and slightly bent, and exactly the right size to prevent the circuit from closing. Blackwood turned. His arm was bleeding through his sleeve, and his expression had passed through pain into something that had been stripped of every social layer. Just intent. He reached for the key. Crow's hand closed on his wrist from behind. Crow was still upright, still bleeding, still making calculations. He pulled Blackwood back from the box with the mechanical patience of a man who had committed to a direction and was finishing it. "The key stays," Crow said. Blackwood looked at the junction box, at the brass key wedged in the mechanism, at Crow's hand on his wrist. He stopped. Outside, through the signal car window, the quarry spur line ran parallel to the main canyon track for 60 yards before diverging. Evelyn watched the freight cars moving down the spur, slowing the prisoners visible now at the open door. The locomotive and passenger cars hit the junction at the redirected switch point. For a moment, everything was undecided, the train moving at speed, the switch position, the fog, the grade. Then the locomotive followed the switch and pulled the passenger cars with it onto the quarry spur. Not fast enough to stop cleanly, but fast enough to stop before the bridge. The locomotive hit the quarry buffer with a sound that Evelyn felt in her back teeth, then silence except for the cooling metal and the wind and the very distant sound of someone, somewhere on the train, beginning to shout for help in a voice that had panic in it, but not injury. Passengers, shaken, frightened, alive. Blackwood tried once more to reach the detonation box. Crow held him. Evelyn removed the brass key and put it in her coat pocket and looked at the man who had spent a year of her life trying to reduce her to silence. He looked smaller in the signal car than he had in his Denver office. Still dangerous wounded animals were always dangerous, but smaller. "You still need me to testify," she said. "I'm the only person who can identify your operators by rhythm. Without my testimony, your lawyers argue every coded message is ambiguous." She paused. "So you need to stop reaching for that box." He looked at her with his arm bleeding, and his plan derailed, and his hired men beginning to understand outside that the guards had lost, and the workers were free, and the train was in the wrong location. He stopped reaching. From the junction clearing, visible through the signal car window, Caleb was moving along the quarry spur toward the train. Evelyn watched him come. He was checking the cars as he went freight car first, then the passenger section, moving with the focused speed of a man running through a checklist rather than running toward a feeling. She recognized the discipline in it. She also recognized, from the way he looked up at each window as he passed, what he was actually looking for. She found the door to the signal car platform and opened it. The cold came in immediately. She stepped out onto the platform and looked down the track toward him. He saw her. He stopped. She'd been told once by a man who didn't deserve her attention that a woman who dealt in words and signals was just a person who couldn't act. She'd thought about that a fair amount over the past several weeks, about whether that was true, about what action actually looked like when the instrument was language and timing, and the ability to put the right information in the right channel at the right moment. She'd saved 30 passengers and 9 workers, and the bridge was intact, and Blackwood was in a signal car with one working arm and a witness who had turned against him. She thought the question was probably settled. Caleb reached the signal car and looked up at her. His shoulder had been wrapped. Someone had done it in the field. She could see the improvised bandage under his torn coat. His expression ran through several things in quick succession and settled on relief. "You sent the timing signal," he said. "You were at the switch," she said. He climbed up to the platform. He put his good hand on her face and looked at her for a moment, checking, assessing the same checklist he'd been running down the length of the train. She let him. "Crow's inside with Blackwood," she said. "We need someone official before Blackwood decides the situation is still manageable. The workers are free. The passengers are intact." He lowered his hand. "Tomas has 3 of Blackwood's guards already." "The payment crates," she said. "If his hired men realize he was going to kill them." "They've been realizing it for the last 10 minutes, Caleb said. "They're not currently interested in protecting him." Inside the signal car, Blackwood said something sharp and controlled to Crow. Crow said very clearly, "No." Evelyn and Caleb went inside. In the corner of the car, behind the detonation equipment, they found the first payment crate. Then another. And beneath those, the written schedules, train numbers, robbery dates, payment amounts, the names of 3 false freight companies, written in Blackwood's own handwriting, because had trusted no one else with the original records. Evelyn picked up the first document. "Read it." Every number matched what she'd memorized in Denver. Every number. After they brought Blackwood out of the signal car and handed him to the workers and the passengers and the growing collection of witnesses at the junction clearing, Caleb stood beside her on the quarry spur track. The fog was lifting. The canyon walls were becoming visible above them, pale and enormous in the early light. He looked at the clearing, at Tomas organizing the guard's surrender with the patient efficiency of a man who'd spent his career managing things that could go wrong. At the passengers, standing in uncertain groups near the locomotive, some of them writing in notebooks, some talking to workers, some just standing and breathing. Then he turned and went back down the spur line toward the signal tower. "Caleb," she called. He disappeared around the curve of the track. She found him 60 seconds later, standing at the base of the signal tower with her brass telegraph key in his hand. She hadn't felt it leave her pocket. She didn't know when he'd taken it. He looked at the key, at the tower, at her. Then he put the key in her hand and closed her fingers around it. Inside the tower, the sounder came to life. She looked at it through the window, tapping, patient and deliberate. "Caleb, look up." He looked up. She was already at the tower door. She was on the signal tower platform when he reached the base. He looked up through the clearing fog and saw her standing at the rail with her hand pressed flat against the iron railing and her coat open and her hair coming loose from its pins in the canyon wind. She was looking down at him with the expression of someone who had just finished something very large and was still taking stock of all the pieces. He climbed the tower stairs without speaking. When he reached the platform, he didn't say anything immediately. He looked at her hand, the right one, the wrapped one, bleeding again through the fresh linen, and then at her face. "May I?" he said. She held out her hand. He took it carefully, supporting the weight from below rather than gripping, and looked at the bandage. The bleeding was from effort, not from new injury, the kind that would stop with pressure and rest, assuming she allowed both. "Can you get down the stairs?" he said. "Yes," she said. He kept hold of her hand on the way down, not pulling, not guiding, just present, and she let him. Blackwood was transferred to federal custody 8 days later. The circuit judge arrived from Cheyenne with a federal investigator and a court reporter and a very particular expression on his face when he saw the volume of documentation waiting for him. Payment crates, written schedules, transmission records copied by 3 independent operators who'd received Evelyn's emergency signal, testimony from Crow, testimony from the workers, testimony from several of Blackwood's own guards who had decided that cooperation served their interests better than loyalty to a man who'd been planning to put them in an ammunition car. Crow testified he received a reduced sentence for what he'd done and a separate accounting for what he hadn't. The judge made the distinction clearly in the record. Evelyn thought that was probably the most honest legal outcome she'd witnessed. The 12 accused workers were cleared of all charges in a proceeding that took less time than the original accusation had taken to file. Tomas sat in the front row and listened to his name removed from a criminal record with the careful attention of someone who intended to remember every word. He became superintendent of an independent worker-owned track company the following spring. He came to the telegraph office before he left Red Hollow and stood in the doorway and looked at Evelyn at her desk. "Shaw," he said. "Ortega," she said. He nodded once. It covered a great deal of ground. Sarah regained control of the Red Hollow post and telegraph office before the snow came. She rehung her own sign above the door and put a small brass plate below it that read "Emergency transmissions received at all hours." She also put a chair by the stove for anyone who needed to warm up before or after sending a message, which she said was practical and had nothing to do with sentiment. Miriam continued, treating Evelyn's hand through the winter. The 2 damaged fingers recovered partial movement, more than Miriam had initially predicted, less than full function. They remained stiff in cold weather. The ring finger had a particular limitation that made certain grip angles difficult. Evelyn relearned her transmission technique around those angles. It took 8 weeks. By the end, her speed was nearly what it had been before Denver, and her accuracy was better because she'd had to become conscious of every movement she'd previously made without thinking. Amos had told her once that the hand wasn't the point. She'd understood it abstractly then. She understood it differently now. Blackwood's railroad holdings were divided after his investors withdrew in the weeks following his arrest. The process was not swift or clean, but it moved forward in a direction that couldn't be reversed, which was what mattered. The freight contracts were redistributed. The company housing was sold at assessed value rather than company terms. The workers who'd been living in Blackwood-controlled tenements started paying rent to landlords who had no interest in anyone's labor disputes. The main telegraph office in Red Hollow changed hands. It took 3 months and several legal maneuvers by Sarah that Evelyn chose not to examine too closely. The result was an independent operation with a new sign and 2 new operators and a rate sheet that didn't charge extra for emergency transmissions. Caleb rebuilt the stable through November and December with help from Tomas's crew, who came on their off days without being asked and without charging for labor. The new stable was larger than the old one. The construction was better. He made the roof in 2 sections so that if one part ever caught fire again, the other section could be isolated. He received an offer to resume railroad security work in January. The offer was from a new independent company, not Blackwood's successor, and the terms were genuinely good. He read the letter twice. Then he wrote back a polite refusal and explained that he'd found different work. The relay station he built at the ranch connected 4 remote communities to Evelyn's telegraph network. Postal riders, railroad inspectors, and Army couriers all ran through Mercer Ranch as a midpoint, which meant Caleb's days were organized and purposeful and involved a great deal of horses, which suited him. He stopped carrying the particular tension she'd learned to read in his shoulders, not all at once, gradually. The way ice leaves a creek in March 1st around the edges, then from the center until one morning you look and the water is just moving freely. The offer from Denver came in February. A major telegraph company wanted Evelyn to manage a regional office, her expertise, her reputation among independent operators, her ability to train new transmitters. The salary was significant. The position was real. The letter was addressed to her name, without any reference to Mercer Ranch. She read it at her desk in the telegraph office. Read it again, put it in her coat pocket, and went home. Caleb was in the kitchen when she came in. He looked at her expression and waited. She put the letter on the table. He read it, set it down. Then he went to the shelf by the study door and came back with an envelope money. She could tell by the weight when he set it in front of her. That's enough for the journey and 3 months. While you get settled, he said. I can get more if you need it. She looked at the envelope, then at him. You're doing it again, she said. He opened his mouth. You're assuming, she said. You're assuming that the right thing is to make sure I can leave, and you're presenting the assumption as generosity. And you haven't asked me a single question. He was quiet for a moment. You're right, I know I am. What do you want to do, he said. And this time he asked it the way she'd taught him, genuinely open, genuinely, waiting with no answer already prepared behind his eyes. She sat down. I want to establish a regional office in Red Hollow. I want to negotiate with the Denver company to have their traffic route through our lines rather than the other way around. She paused. Red Hollow is already positioned correctly. We have the independent line. We have Sarah's network. We have your relay station. A regional office here serves the same territory as one in Denver and costs them less in infrastructure. Caleb considered this. Will they accept that arrangement? I think so. They want the network more than they want the address. She looked at him. I'll write to them tomorrow. He nodded. Then he said the thing she could see him working toward. When the danger ended, when you didn't need my name or the ranch for protection anymore, he met her gaze. Do you want to continue the marriage? She looked at him across the kitchen table in the February afternoon light. This careful, damaged, honest man who asked before he helped and waited for the answer, and had learned, slowly and at some cost, that love was not the same as management. Necessity brought us together, she said. It didn't create what came after. He held her gaze. I choose this, she said. I choose you. Not because I have to. He sat with that for a moment in the way he sat, with everything that mattered fully, without deflecting it into something easier. Then he stood up and went to the study and came back with a telegraph machine from their wedding night. He'd repaired it over the winter. She knew she'd seen it on the shelf, but hadn't asked, letting him come to it in his own time. He set it on the kitchen table between them. She looked at it, the brass fittings he'd cleaned, the sounder he'd adjusted, the key that sat exactly where it always had. She reached out with her right hand and placed her fingers on the key. The pain came immediately. 2 fingers, stiff with cold, the old injury announcing itself the way it always did in February. She stopped. Caleb removed his hand from where it had rested near the machine. He didn't reach for the key. He didn't suggest she use her left hand. He just waited with the particular quality of patience that she'd come to understand was not passive. It was active, intentional, the discipline of a person choosing to let someone else determine the pace. Looked at her fingers on the key. It still hurts a little, she said. Let's try again. He placed his hand over hers, not taking the key. Just present, adding warmth to her fingers in the cold kitchen, steadying without steering. Together they pressed the key. The sounder came to life. The signal went out across the line, through Sarah's network, through the relay station at the ranch, through the independent line that ran east and west across the open territory. Clean and clear and carrying exactly what they'd sent. 2 words. Line open. Outside the kitchen window, horses moved through the rebuilt relay yard. The telegraph wires stretched east toward the sunrise and west toward the mountains, thin and purposeful against the February sky. The town of Red Hollow was waking up smoke from chimneys, a door opening somewhere on the main street, the distant sound of the morning train on the northern line running on schedule. Evelyn looked at the sounder, at the brass key between their hands, at Caleb, beside her in the morning light. The line was open. It had been, she thought, for longer than either of them had admitted. There's something this story keeps coming back to, and it isn't the train. It isn't the villain, or the explosives, or even the telegraph. It's a question that runs underneath all of it. Quiet and persistent, what does it actually mean to trust someone? We tend to think of trust as a feeling, something that arrives on its own, like weather. You either feel it or you don't. But Evelyn and Caleb tell a different story. Trust, in this story, is a verb. It's something you do before you're certain. It's Evelyn reading the code aloud, while Caleb presses the key, 2 people who have known each other for 4 hours, building something functional out of necessity, and choosing slowly to let it become something real. Evelyn arrives in Red Hollow already knowing what it costs to depend on someone. She has the injury to prove it. The men who crushed her hand against that telegraph desk weren't trying to hurt her. They were trying to teach her a lesson that a woman's voice could always be taken away, that communication was a privilege that powerful men could revoke whenever they chose. And the lesson she teaches back over the course of this story is that they were wrong, not because she found a way to fight them on their terms, but because she found someone willing to fight beside her on hers. That distinction matters. Caleb doesn't save Evelyn. He becomes useful to her. There's a significant difference, and the story is careful about it. Every time he reaches for a decision that belongs to her, the train ticket, the solo approach of the tower, the offer of money and freedom, she names what he's doing, and he has to reckon with it. Protection that doesn't ask permission isn't protection. It's control with a kinder face. Caleb has to learn that. He learns it slowly, imperfectly, the way most real learning happens, and what makes him worth reading is that he keeps learning even when it's uncomfortable. Evelyn has to learn something too. She has to learn that accepting help is not the same as surrendering authority. She spent years building a life where she needed nothing from anyone, and then the people who wanted to silence her took that life apart in a single night. What she carries out of that attack besides the injury, besides the memorized codes, is a belief that needing someone makes you vulnerable in a way you can't recover from. The story asks her to test that belief against the evidence, and the evidence is Caleb. Consistent, patient, present Caleb, who stops when she says stop and continues when she says try again. And then there's the title itself. It hurts. Let's try again. 4 words that could mean a dozen things depending on the context, and the story plays that ambiguity completely straight. It sounds like one thing. It is something else entirely. And that gap between what something appears to be and what it actually is the entire engine of the plot. The false confessions that carry real warnings. The villain who looks like a businessman. The guard who appears to betray them and then doesn't entirely. The marriage that looks like necessity and becomes something freely chosen. This story is set in 1887, but it isn't really about 1887. It's about the specific kind of courage it takes to keep transmitting when the signal keeps getting cut. To keep saying the true thing, even when the channel is compromised. To trust that someone on the other end is listening, and that your message, however damaged, however imperfect the instrument will reach them. Communication is the oldest form of power there is. Evelyn knows this. Amos taught her. What the story adds is something Amos couldn't teach directly. That communication between two people who trust each other is different from communication alone. It carries more, it reaches further, and when the line finally opens at the end, in a cold February kitchen, with 2 damaged fingers and 1 steady hand over hers, it opens in both directions at once. Line open. That's not just a telegraph transmission. That's the whole story in 2 words. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons or historical events is coincidental and unintentional.